Imagine building a perfect world, a utopia. Every need is met. There are no predators, no hunger, nothing to fear. Now, what if that very perfection was actually a recipe for total annihilation? This is the story of Universe 25, a real experiment that created a paradise for mice and then watched it burn. This is the exact question that an ethologist named John Calhoun was obsessed with. He just had to know what happens to us, to a society, when you remove all the outside pressures. The answer he found, well, it was more horrifying than anyone could have possibly imagined.
So take a look at this. This was the paradise, a carefully designed enclosure that, for the mice living inside, was a world without limits, unlimited resources, total safety. It was the perfect place to live, or so it seemed.
Okay, let's start at the very beginning, back in the hopeful early days of this mouse Garden of Eden.
So, back in 1968, Calhoun gets this experiment going at the National Institute of Mental Health. He gave these mice literally everything they could ever want. Food was always available, so was water, and plenty of nesting material. The whole place was kept clean, the temperature was perfect. There was only one thing, one resource that was finite: space. In the beginning, it was so simple. He took just 8 healthy mice, 4 males and 4 females, and put them into this perfect world. And then he and his team just watched. For the first 2 months, it was great. It was idyllic. The mice explored, they built nests, they started having babies. Everything was going according to plan.
But that paradise, it didn't last long. As the population started to grow, the utopia began to crack, and then it just shattered, revealing this dark, psychological horror story playing out in real time.
This timeline just lays out the whole grim path to ruin. You can see that around day 315, the population hits 600, and that's when social structures start to collapse. By day 560, it peaks at 2,200 mice, and the whole place is just chaos. And then, the fall. The very last baby is conceived on day 920. And then, a little while later, in May of 1973, the last mouse died. The entire colony was extinct.
Now, that number, 2,200, that's the key. Calhoun's theory was that the problem wasn't just physical crowding, it was social crowding. There were simply too many mice for the number of meaningful social roles available. Think about it. Young mice were being born into a world where every job, every territory, every spot in the social ladder was already taken. They were born into a world without a purpose.
And the results of that were absolutely catastrophic. Males became super aggressive. They formed these violent gangs. Mothers started abandoning their young. Infant mortality in some parts of the pen hit 96%. Cannibalism became common. Sex became distorted, often violent. But maybe the strangest thing to emerge was this kind of complete social death.
Calhoun gave them a name. He called them the beautiful ones. These were male mice who looked perfect. They were healthy, sleek, their fur was perfectly groomed, but they were completely checked out. They withdrew from all the chaos, never fighting, never mating, doing nothing but eating, sleeping, and grooming themselves. They were physically alive, but socially, they were already ghosts.
Calhoun himself summed up the horror with these words, and they're just chilling. The mice had forgotten how to be mice. They lost the ability to do things essential for their own survival, like courtship, mating, raising their young. Their spirit just died, long before their bodies did. It was an extinction of behavior that led to the extinction of the entire population.
So what in the world was the mechanism behind this collapse? Well, Calhoun came up with a term for it, a term that has echoed through our culture ever since.
He called it the behavioral sink. It describes this kind of vortex of bad behavior that happens when you get overcrowding. He noticed mice would all cram into certain pens, even when other pens were totally empty. He called it a pathological togetherness. It's this bizarre impulse to be near others, even when that closeness is causing incredible stress and violence.
And so, naturally, the next question was the big one. Was this just a weird, sad story about some mice, or was it a dark prophecy for us?
The idea of the behavioral sink, well, it completely exploded out of the laboratory and into pop culture. It just became this powerful metaphor for what could go wrong. Look at this. This is a Batman comic where the villain Ratcatcher is literally lecturing his rat army on the lessons from Calhoun's experiments. The story was just that powerful.
It really tapped into all the anxieties of the 1970s. People were terrified of the population bomb, of cities decaying, of rising crime rates. It felt like they were watching Calhoun's experiment play out in real life. It influenced dystopian movies like Soylent Green and even journalists like Tom Wolfe, who wrote this famous essay called Sliding Down into the Behavioral Sink.
But let's be real. Can we draw a straight line from mice in a box to people in a city? The debate is pretty fierce. On one hand, people who say yes argue that it's not about biology, it's about social structure. Losing your purpose, losing a meaningful role in society, that's going to cause problems for any species. But on the other hand, others argue that humans are just fundamentally different. We have culture, we have technology, we can innovate our way out of problems, and, unlike the mice, human birth rates actually tend to fall when we have abundance. The science on human crowding, it's been inconclusive, to say the least.
So, how should we think about this experiment today, with decades of hindsight?
Well, from a modern scientific point of view, Universe 25 is kind of riddled with issues. Calhoun himself admitted it wasn't really normal science. His analysis was very observational, very subjective. Critics pointed out he didn't collect hard data like stress hormone levels. And let's be honest, by today's ethical standards for animal welfare, you could never, ever do an experiment like this. Plus, it gave people a dangerously simple excuse for complex city problems, ignoring huge factors like poverty and inequality.
But here's the thing that often gets lost in the telling. Calhoun himself wasn't some prophet of doom. He was actually an optimist. He saw his work not as a prediction of our inevitable future, but as a warning that could inspire us to change. He hoped that architects and city planners would see his work and use it to design better cities, better buildings, better spaces that reduce stress and allow for both community and privacy.
Which leaves us with a pretty haunting final thought for our own time. The experiment's warnings about losing meaningful social roles, well, they feel eerily relevant in an age of automation and the internet, don't they? We might not be physically crammed into a single pen, but we live in these vast digital crowds, and yet we often feel more isolated than ever. Has all this technology, in its promise to build us a new kind of utopia, actually created the perfect conditions for a new kind of behavioral sink? It's definitely a thought worth thinking about.